Alright, I'm back here at the Canton shop, and we have a totalizer we've had for years here, and I wanted to get some more detailed footage of this to include with this video series, because down at the Columbus job we couldn't get the camera in to catch all the angles of it, so I wanted to explain a couple more things in detail. So down here is where the hydraulic lines coming from the load cells, the hydraulic load cells in the scale, are connected at. Okay, this is an 8 cell tower for an 8 load cell scale. Now you can disconnect these lines from this plate and have them just free hang, and of course connect the hydraulic lines from the load cells to it, which is what we did down there in Columbus. But at any rate, the fluid from the load cells comes up through these lines. There's 4 on this side, 4 on that side. Comes into the valve body, and then it's sent up to the individual, I guess the best way to call them are diaphragms, totalizer diaphragms. I don't know if that's the official name, but that's what we're going to call it today. Now, when we were bleeding this system, okay, and it's super critical to get every bit of air out of this system or it won't work. What we were doing was we had a grease gun full of hydraulic fluid connected up right here. And if you notice, they were holding the grease gun upside down so that we weren't pumping any air into it. All we were doing is pumping fluid. So we were pumping it in here. And if we wanted to bleed out load cell number 1, we would crack open that valve and we would start pumping. Fluid would be pumped into load cell number 1, and then if you look, right there's the bleeder for it. Okay, now when you come up to load cell number 2, the bleeder for it is right here, and then 3, 4, 5, and so forth and so on. So you would bleed out number 1, close it, open number 2, start pumping fluid in, come up here, bleed it out of number 2. Once you're bled, shut number 2 off, go to number 3, and then so forth and so on, all the way around. When it came time to bleed out the actual load cells that are underneath the scale, we did the exact same thing, guys. We're just hooked into here. We open this up and we start pumping fluid. It's not going to go up into here because this bleeder is shut, so it's going to take the path of least resistance, which is the flow down here, out to the scale, into the load cell, and come out the bleeder port of the load cell. I know trying to make this make as much sense as possible and not overly complicated, but that is what we were doing when we were bleeding it. So first thing we did, we bled down the whole thing, the whole totalizer stack. Once we did that, then we went right back through, reopened these one at a time, bled out the actual load cells underneath the scale. 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and so forth and so on. Now, to adjust these things, if you have a section error, first of all, you can't really adjust a section, you have to adjust cells. Load cell number 1 cannot be adjusted, so you have to adjust 2 through 8 to load cell number 1. And the way that you do that is, let's suppose that I need to adjust number 8. I'm going to adjust these bolts right here, and there's 3 sets. There's a set there, a set there, and then there's one back behind on the back side. If I need to speed up that load cell, I'm going to move 2 flats. So I'm going to loosen this nut here. I'm going to take this nut and I'm going to go 2 flats of the nut, tighten it, which is going to raise this. And for every 2 flats, that's 20 pounds of adjustment. So 2 flats, 2 flats, and back around on the backside 2 flats. And then I'm going to lock the top nuts back down. If I need to slow the load cell down, I'm going to do just the opposite. Bear with me, get my finger in here. Instead of tightening this up 2 flats, I'm going to loosen it 2 flats. And then lock down, lock down, lock down. So raise this up to speed the section up, drop it down to slow it down. Hopefully I got that right. I've adjusted these before, and I'll be honest with you, anybody that's done these, you have to stop a lot of times and think, which way do I got to go? But that is a little bit more detail of the totalizer, how it works, and what we were doing when we were bleeding it. Guys, I want to talk about changing out the electronic load cell. Let me get my finger in there, that blue thing, on one of these hydraulic scale totalizers. If that load cell goes bad and we have to change it out, there's some tips that will help you do that. So basically, the stack here sits on top of that load cell, and I know I'm not going to be able to get this very well in this video, but right in there is a button on top of that load cell that all of that stack sits on. Okay, and to get that load cell out of there, there's a couple things we got to do. So you're still going to have the dead weight of the scale that is going to be applying pressure to this totalizer. So the dead weight of the scale sitting on all the hydraulic load cells, that force is being fed into this totalizer here, and that totalizer is going to be pushing down on that load cell. So the first thing we have to do before we can get this load cell out of here is we got to get the force of this totalizer stack off of that. And the easiest way to do it, I was talking to Ron and Steve in Mansfield, is to take a couple wedges or even a couple chisels and basically jam them in right here. Maybe say one here and one on the around on the back. And again, you don't want to beat on them because this is all aluminum, but stick them in there, firmly drive them in there, which will lift just a few thousandths. It'll lift that totalizer stack or take the pressure off of this load cell. From there is a bolt that goes up through the bottom of this plate. It's an Allen head bolt. I believe it either needs a 3/8 or maybe a 1/2 inch Allen wrench. I forget which. But to access it, we need to remove these 2 bolts, and then there's 2 around on the back. You can see the one on the back on that side and the one on the back on that side. Take those 4 bolts out. That allows this whole assembly to be rocked forward off of this thin base plate here that my finger's at. Once you do that, you can get to that Allen bolt that goes up through this plate. Now, as you start to loosen that Allen bolt, this load cell is going to spin. They have a hole right there where my finger's at, and then there's a couple more. You can kind of see that one in there on the other side, and then there's another one on the other side, and then there's one around back. Now, Ron in Mansfield said that Winslow builds a spanner wrench type of assembly that'll go around this load cell. It has little tips that go into these holes, and it'll hold that load cell steady while you undo the Allen bolt. Now, most of the branches aren't going to have that wrench, so what I would suggest is taking a punch, sticking in that hole, and then as that cell begins to spin, that punch will jam up against this post, and then you can get that bolt out of there. Once that bolt's out, then guys, that cell just slides out of there, and put your new cell in, reverse the whole process and come up here, pull your chisels out so that the pressure of the totalizer comes back down on the cell, and you should be good to go. I wanted to give you guys a close-up shot of a hydraulic load cell, because when we were shooting that video there with the Columbus guys and Mansfield and Dayton, the load cells were installed in the scale, so it was kind of hard to get a complete view of everything. And so I just kind of want to point this stuff out real quick so that you can kind of know what we're talking about when we're talking about bleeder ports and gauge ports and all of that. So right here is where the hydraulic line gets attached to the load cell. Okay, that's pretty self-explanatory. There's a piece of line right there, and there's a swag lock or swage lock, however you want to pronounce it. And then right here is the bleeder port. It's just like on a brake caliper. You would crack this open to bleed the air out of the bottom of that load cell. And then this plastic piece here is the gauge port, okay? And that is where you would put your feeler gauge in. You would pump fluid into here. The diaphragm rises inside of this port until it pinches the feeler gauge. And then you know you have the proper gap. And there are, get that thing in there, there's 3 of these gauge ports, and you can't always get to them either. So in this particular load cell, you've got 1, spin her around, there's 2, and there's the 3rd one. And then back around to where we started. This is the rubber boot up here that Ron was talking about that oftentimes gets cracked or broke, and then it allows water to get down into that load cell. So those are the components of the hydraulic load cells.